Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this wonderful welcome. I know Shabir and we feel like we're royalty on this visit. It's one delicious meal after another and wonderful sights, so thank you all for the welcome. And it's great to be here in this fabulous university. The title of my talk today, Presentation of Quantitative and Thematic Evaluation of the Early Quran in Mecca. And this is based on my second book project on the Quran. My first one was published in 2014, and it's entitled Structure and Quranic Interpretation. This is a study of the composition of the Quran. On the macro level, how the Quran is interconnected between all the 114 surahs. On the medium level, how each individual surah is intricately put together. And also you see the symmetries and the coherence, even on the level of the individual verses. For example, Ayat al-Kursi has a wonderful ring structure. So it's a contemplation of the symmetries and the coherence that are discoverable on numerous levels in all places in the Quran. And in answer to the question of this conference today, why am I a Muslim? I can simply answer it's because of the amazing Quran. I've been studying it for about 15, 20 years now, and I'm never failed to be totally amazed by its extraordinary, astounding power and its beauty. Today's talk, though, is on my current research. I'm looking more at the historical development of the revelation over the course of 23 years, and it has 6 parts. Start with a theoretical introduction about using the mean verse lengths or the average verse lengths of surahs as a chronological marker, going from short surah lengths, verse lengths in the early Meccan period on to much longer verse lengths in the Medinan period. And then I will make an argument for using the actual Medina I counting system as the reference. And by measuring the Quran according to the verse lengths, average verse lengths of the surahs, it enables us to demarcate or identify a likely set of early Meccan surahs that roughly you could divide in 3 stages: the early Meccan Quran, the first 5 years or so, and then the later phase in Mecca, and of course followed by the Medinan phase at the end. Today's presentation, after dealing with these introductory parts, will focus on the first 21 surahs by their mean verse length order, the ones with the shortest verse lengths. And we will analyze their content in general, and then specifically, stylometrically, compare the incidences of warnings of punishment and descriptions of hell to their opposite, the encouragement to the believers, the Muslimin, and the descriptions of heaven. And then finally, I'll conclude by trying to relate this early Quranic message, the first couple years when the Prophet was addressing mostly kuffar or pagans, and relate it to its late antique context. In 2017, Nikolai Sinai discussed this mean verse lengths as a marker, chronological marker of surahs, again going from short, early Meccan surahs to much longer verses in the Medinan period. And this is something that's long been observed about the 23 years of revelation. I'm sure many of you have noticed it yourself, how concise the early surahs are, and how much longer the verses are in the Medinan period. Just look at one example, a comparison from Surah Al-Buruj, the first 4 verses, a series of oaths, and then a pronouncement, وَالسَّمَاءِ ذَاتِ الْبُرُوجِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْمَوْعُودِ وَشَاهِدٍ وَمَشْهُودٍ قُتِلَ أَصْحَابُ الْأُخْدُودِ. And today I'm using Arbery's English translation, the oaths here: by heaven and the constellations, by the promised day, by the witness and the witnessed, cursed were the men of the pit. And these were probably people who burned alive, believers about a century before Islam in Najran in South Arabia, and they will face their punishment, of course, in the afterlife. So these are some very likely early Meccan verses, and compare that to the opening of Al-Ma'idah, the first verse, a later Medinan revelation, Ya ayyuhal alladhina amanu أوفوا بالعقود وحلت لكم بهيمة الأنعام إلا ما يتلى عليكم غير محلي الصيد وأنتم حرم إن الله يحكم ما يريد. The translation, O believers, fulfill your bonds. Permitted to you is the beast of the flocks, Except that which is now recited to you, so that you deem not game permitted to be hunted when you are in pilgrim sanctity. God decrees whatsoever he desires. So if you go back and look at the previous example, this one verse is longer than all the previous ones combined. So this is, you see the phenomenon in the later Medinan revelations, the verses tend to be much longer. And Sinai takes it a step further and does an electronic count of all the verses in the Quran using the transcription letters, Latin letters. And actually, because of an orthographic convention in Arabic, like Ar-Rahman, you don't write the long aleph. It's there, but it's not written. But transcription letters actually give a more accurate representation of the length of the verse. So he did an electronic count of all the verses, then calculated the mean verse length, so the average verse lengths for the entire Quran, the 114 revelations. And here they're plotted according to their ascending verse length, starting with Al-Asr, 103 at the beginning. And you see going up for about 5 till you hit Al-Hijr, number 15, there's about a 11% suddenly a jump in the verse length, and then we'll talk more about that later. But here are the first 50 surahs arranged according to their verse length, and then continuing going all the way up to Al-Mumtahana. Over the course of the Quran, 114 revelations, 23 years, there's about a 13-fold increase in the average length of the verses. And he computes these according to the standard Kufan numbering system. I'm going to now make a case for using the first Medinan count instead. As you may know, there are 7 systems that were canonized in the early century, the first 2 centuries of Islam. The first Medinan counting system, second Medinan counting system, the Meccan counting, Damascus, Hims, which is an incomplete count, and Basra, and Kufa. And since for about a century, since the publication of the Royal Cairo Quran that Brother Shabir mentioned, the Kufan counting system is the standard one, with the exception of Morocco, North Africa. They still use the second Medinan counting system. And how are these different? First of all, they're vastly similar. There's some 6,236 verses of the Quran. For 96% of the verses, these systems are identical. So we're only talking differences relating to about 4% of the Quran. Still, those are 272 to 276 verses where one system will say, put the verse divider here. No, this is the end of the verse. And another system will say, no, the verse actually ends in a different place. Of course, it's the same text in all of them. It's just a matter of how you divide up the verses. These are the differences. I decided to do a statistical and literary comparison of this 4% of the Quran where they have differences about the placement of the divider, following this thematic principle that an original or stem system will most often side with the majority. And in fact, most of these 272 differences feature like 5 or 6 systems saying that the verse ends right here, and then one system will have a different, no, the verse ends right here. And in fact, the first Medinan system has the most often occurrences, 92% of the time it's in the majority position. And surprisingly, the Kufan system, it's only 68% of the time occurring in the majority position. First of all, the sources. How did I compare these? The main one is from Al-Andalus, Abi Amr al-Dani, in the 5th century, wrote Al-Bayan fi Addi Ay al-Quran, and he lists all the Ru'us al-Ay, where each of these 7 systems, where they identify the end of a verse, different from the other ones. I compared that to his Eastern counterpart, Ibn Abd al-Kafi, Adad Surah al-Quran, and using the very helpful tables compiled by the German scholar Spitaler de Versailung des Quran. He basically has for every surah a table. Okay, this is where the first Medinan divides this verse, this is where the second, and so forth. So those are the sources. And I compiled a list of all these 272 differences, and I'll just show you an example here, Al-Fatiha and Al-Baqarah. Again, the Hims counting system is incomplete. So here, there's only the first Medinan, second Medinan, Meccan counting system, Damascus, Basra, and Kufa. So there's 6 systems there. And for the Basmala, the Meccan system and the Kufan system both count this. The Basmala is the first verse of the Quran, whereas the first Medinan, second Medinan, Damascene, and Basran system 4 say, no, this is actually an invocation, like other places of the Quran, and the first verse is Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Likewise, those 4 systems, at the 7th verse, they put a divider after Sirat al-Ladhina an'amta alayhim. They put a divider there. Then غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِينَ. They count that the 7th verse. Then Al-Baqarah. Here again, the HIMS system is incomplete, so there are only 6 different systems that are indicated. And sometimes there a rawi, or an authority, for one of the systems, there'll be 2 or 3 of them, and they'll split about exactly where the verse ends. So if you see verse 197, there are 2 versions of where the Damascene ending should be. That's why I put a question mark. In fact, all but the first Medinan and Kufan have different sources. The Kufan is on every single difference. There's no, this is the Kufan tradition puts it here. Likewise, the first Medinan. All the other systems, in some places, there'll be dispute. One Rawi says it's here, and others differs. So, for example, Alif Lam Mim. The Kufan system is the only one that counts, this is the verse. 5 other ones, Alif Lam Mim ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. And that's the end of the first verse. So these are the sort of differences we're talking about. And I did a statistical analysis of the incidence of these differences. Again, looking for which one most often sides with the majority, which one doesn't, or is there one that most often will side with the majority, indicating it's a likely original or stem, and that maybe these other systems were variants of that prototype system. And here there are 3 different tallies. The first tally is the incidence of a strong majority position. And according to stematology, the main or root or stem system should most often occur when there's 5 or 6 systems saying it ends here and only one outlier saying it ends somewhere else. So this is just a count of how many times the various systems align with a strong majority against one other system. Either 6 against 1, or if HIMS is not counted, 5 against 1. And in this case, the first Medinan system has the most incidences, followed by the Meccan, and followed by the second Medinan, which is used in North Africa, the Basran for Damascus, and then Kufa. So this is one tally, one indicator. And there's another one you can do looking at the data, is the total number of majority instances. Not just the strong majority, but which one most often will take a majority position, whether it's 6 against 1, 5 against 1, 5 against 2, 4 systems against 2, or 4 against 3. And again, according to stematics, the stem or root or an original system should most often be siding with the majority, not a minority position. This is the count of these, looking at these small 4% of the verses where they differ about the placement of a verse divider. Again, you see the first Medinan is most often in a majority position, and second in this case is the second Medinan counting system. Here, the third is Mecca instead of position number 2, and the 4th is Basra, and then the 5th is Damascus, and then the Kufan system, surprisingly, is least often in the majority position, a total majority position. Again, this is not looking at any literary factors, but just how often each system sides with the majority. There was one last tally that I did, and according to stematology, again, a original or a root system or a stem system should least often take an extreme minority position, 1 against 5 or 1 against 6. So I counted up how many times, for example, Medina I, how many instances it's in an extreme minority position, 4 or 5, depending on, in one case there's a rawi or a source there's a question about him. Mecca is the second least often. The Medina II count is the third least often. Then Basra, Damascus, and then the Kufan system, which is quite idiosyncratic. It is the most often, 57 occasions where it's taking position. The ayah ends right here, whereas 5 or 6 other systems indicate no, the ayah should end somewhere else, later or before. This just summarizes the three tallies, the three ontological comparisons, one being the most likely stem. The first one, again, the extreme or strong positive, 5 or 6 against 1. And the second one, how many times total majority positions. And the last one, how many times does it take a strong extreme minority position. In each one of these tallies, in each one of these tests, the statistics are quite conclusive, is that the Medina I system is most likely to be an original or a stem system, and the others are most likely to be branching off that. The second most, in these situations, the Meccan system was second often in the strong majority position, Medina II in the third position, Basra consistently the fourth, and fifth, Damascus. And then very surprisingly, the Kufan system, when I started doing this, I expected this would be the one that's most likely, according to stematology, the root or original one. But according to the statistics, it's the least likely one. It's most often taking a minority position against the other systems. And I then looked at the sort of literary evidence, and there's how do you deal with 272 or 276 verses where there's a difference? I just looked at the times where each system takes a solo position against the other 5 or 6. And I would argue that the 4 to 5 times where the Medina I system is in a strong minority position against all the other systems, but still it seems like the division is logical or it fits with other precedent in the Quran. Here from Al-Baqarah, we go back for a minute, and you see this is one of the, in Al-Baqarah, this is right here, this is one occasion where the Medina I system is in a solo position against all the other systems. And I'll show you in a second how that manifests itself. This is according to the Medina I verse division. Allah waliyul ladina amanu yukhrijuhum min adh-dhulumati ila an-nur. And it puts a verse divider right here, the several dots that Brother Shabir was mentioning. And then the new verse, وَالَّذِينَ كَفْرُوا أَوْلِيَاءُهُمُ الطَّاغُوتُ يُخْرِجُونَهُم مِّنَ النُّورِ إِلَى الظُّلُمَاتِ أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. So this is a unique Medina I verse division after An-Nur. But it has correspondences, or there are precedents elsewhere in the Quran for this type of division. For example, in Al-Ma'idah. Likewise, here you see in these two verses, it's separation between those who believe. God is removing them from darkness to light. And in the next verse, then a separation is talking about the unbelievers. Likewise, you see this same division in Al-Ma'idah. And these verses are talking about Al-Kitab, or the scripture, يَهْدِي بِهِ اللَّهُ مَنْ اتَّبَعَ رِضْوَانَهُ سُبُلَ السَّلَامِ وَيُخْرِجُهُم مِّنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ بِإِذْنِهِ وَيَهْدِيهِمْ إِلَى الصِّرَاطِ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. And then in the next verse, a new verse, it's dealing with the unbelievers. لَقَدْ كَفَرُوا الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْمَسِيحُ ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ. So you see a similar break here, and there's no disagreement. All systems say this is the after the believers as a verse break, and the new verse talks about the الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Also, right at the end, previously we saw in An-Nur, right here, the verse, according to the Medina system, puts a verse division right at the end of Nur. Likewise, there's another example of that, according to the majority division of 5 systems against Basra and Kufa for Surah Ibrahim. وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا مُوسَى بِآيَاتِنَا أَنْ أَخْرِجَ قَوْمَكَ مِنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. And according to 5 systems, there's a break here, just like we saw in Al-Baqarah. And then a new verse, وَذَكِّرْهُمْ بِأَيَّامِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِكُلِّ صَبَّارٍ شَكُورٍ. So I would argue there's literary evidence, or these can be justified, these solo positions of the first Medina system. And it's hard to make the same case for the other ones. In each system, you'll find 1 or 2 that seems unusual or strange verse dividing compared to the other systems. Lastly, I would add, I think that it appears to be the oldest system, and it's the only one, according to the transmitters, it's the only system that's not traced back to some original person who was living after the Prophet. Here, Ibn al-Munadi says, as for the Medina I counting tradition, we do not truly know when it originates. It is as if it's a companion tradition that gained wide acceptance. And due to the number of companions who followed it, it was not ascribed to any one particular source. So, if it precedes the writing of the Codex, or the written Quran, Mus'haf, then it was taken from the mouths of men. If it goes back to a Codex or Mus'haf, on the other hand, then it was taken before any copies were made. So, a historical piece of evidence, it seems to be this is also the oldest counting system. Now, I'll just show you one example of how the difference, or one more example. Again, according to the Meccan and the Kufan dividing systems, this is Al-Fatiha, with the Basmala counted as a verse, as you all know, and then this is the first 7 verses of the Quran, according to the Kufan counting system and according to the Meccan one as well. Can compare that or contrast that with the first Medinan counting system. It's in a majority position. The second Medinan counting system has the same division. The Basran system and also the Damascus system all agree. Notice the Basmala is not counted as a verse, just like everywhere else in the Quran. Here it's an invocation. And the first verse of the Quran, according to these systems, praise be to God, Lord of all peoples. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And also with these systems, I would argue that maybe this is a better division, a thematic division in verses ayat 6 and 7 between the blessed, the Sirat alladhina an'amta alayhim, dealt with or discussed, mentioned in one verse, and then the next verse is those who have God's wrath upon them. غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. I would suggest that this one is preferable, this division, for 3 reasons. For the first being consistency. The Basmala is not counted anywhere in the Quran according to these systems, and of course in Tawbah there is no Basmala. And in terms of the verse evenness, and there's a measure for this, a coefficient of variation. Here the verses are more evenly divided. According to the Meccan and Kufan system, you have a stretched or longer verse at the end. This other one seems more evenly divided, and also thematically it seems to be, and I think it's preferable dividing up the blessed and the new verse, those who have earned God's wrath. Why does all this matter? Well, I would suggest it, first of all, if this is the original, if this is a stem counting system, it's quite likely this is the system that goes back to the original Quran, the way the Prophet divided up the verses, putting these dots or pausing. That aside, it also helps us to compute a more accurate graph of the surahs by their ascending verse length. And you can see here the difference between the Medina I system has 3.5 transcription letters less than the Kufan system. So this is what I've done actually in my forthcoming book project. I've taken what Sinai has done and actually used the mean verse length indicator, and also using the Medina I system, not the Kufan common one like he's using, and used it to demarcate the first 50 or the 50 surahs that have the lowest mean verse lengths, the shortest verses. Again, why 50? Well, it seems to be there's a break. 50 is where you have al-hijr, and after that there's a jump of about 11 or 12% to a new higher verse length. It seems to indicate a new stage, and I hope this is clear. Here they're arranged by their canonical order, these lowest 50 MVL surahs: Al-Fatiha, Al-Hijr, Al-Shu'ara, Al-Safat, Al-Dukhan, Al-Dhariyat, Al-Tur, Al-Najm, Al-Qamar, Al-Rahman, Al-Waqi', and so on. And as you will notice in the continuation, most of these very short surahs, short verse surahs, are placed at the end of the Quran. Most of them occur there. The table shows, first of all, the number of verses according to the Medina I division, and then their mean verse length. The very lowest is Wal Asr, this surah, and then the standard deviation, and then here this coefficient of variation. This is a measure of the evenness of the verses, and the lower the value, the more even The verses are, Al-Kawthar actually has the lowest. Each verse is very similar in length. Today, I'd like to talk about of these 50, the lowest one's the first 21. There's Wal-Asr, Al-Buruj, and Al-Sharh, Al-Inshirah, Al-Mudaththir, and so on. And as you'll notice, in these first 21, according to their verse lengths, some verses are excluded. 1 from Al-Asr, and 5 from Al-Buruj, and 2 from Al-Mudaththir. Why are these excluded? These verses have anomalous verse lengths. They're much longer, and they may indicate, or probably would indicate, a later time of revelation. I'll show one example. Wal-Asr, it's a very pithy, very concise surah. Begins with a very stern pronouncement. Wal-Asr, innal insana lafi khusr. And then this very negative pronouncement about humanity is qualified in the third verse. Save those who believe and do righteous deeds and counsel each other under the truth and counsel each other to be steadfast. This is probably a later addition, perhaps in the Medinan period when there were more believers, and it seems like this verse addresses a community of larger believers. And also at this point, the longer verse lengths of this type were the norm. So I have excluded what seem to be later additions that they're strikingly long in the context, like this verse. And there are only 19. Here you have 19 verses excluded, and a total of 375 verses in these first 25 surahs. And then I want to answer the question, what is most likely the earliest message of the Quran in these very early surahs, considering that the Prophet was in Mecca addressing pagans? And it turns out that by quite a large majority, there's a large percentage of warnings, stern warnings to the unbelievers and descriptions of hell, 31% or 32%. And the next highest in frequency is the signs. These are signs in creation that indicate just as God has created the earth, he can recreate and create again at the time of resurrection. And then third in precedence is the comforting description, the descriptions of heaven, encouragement of the believers. And then the series of oaths like we saw in Al-Buruj, وَالسَّمَاءِ ذَاتِ الْبُرُوجِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْمَوْعُودِ وَالشَّاهِدٍ وَمَشْهُودٍ. Typically these lead to apocalyptic statements. And then comes very strong criticism of the audience. They were not feeding the poor, and they were misers collecting money. So this is very strong criticism of the audience. And then next is personal address from God to the Prophet in this percentage of verses, some 36 verses. Then you have examples of the Quran referring to itself, such as Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, for example. Then these clauses, إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ, these eschatological clauses. And then signs among earlier peoples that people went astray and God destroyed them here. Finally, a couple of verses of praising God and describing God. So I sort of looked at the content of these earliest surahs by their mean verse length to see how they were divided up. And it seems if you add the first three categories together, discussing or warning the unbelievers of their punishment if they don't come to believe in the one God, and descriptions to them of hell, and the signs that God creates, and likewise he's going to recreate or resurrect the dead at Judgment Day. And also then the comforting assurances, the encouragement that the believers are going to have a reward for what they're suffering of persecution, and descriptions of heaven. If you add those together, plus the relevant verses that are talking about punishment in the afterlife, at the end of oath clusters, for example, and eschatological idha clauses, an example of this would be At-Takwir, Surah At-Takwir, إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ وَإِذَا الْجِبَالُ سُيِّرَتْ, when the sun is rolled up, and when the stars lose their light, and when mountains are moved. These continue a series of signs, and when the oceans, seas boil. This leads to verse 14, عَلِمَتْ نَفْسٌ مَا أَحْضَرَتْ. Every soul will know what it has brought forth. This is the sign. The world is ending, and every soul will get what it deserves. If you add up these together, you see that approximately 70% of the earliest verses are dealing either directly describing heaven or hell, or warning or encouraging people about what they're going to have in the afterlife. 70% of the earliest part of the Quran, it seems, is dealing with the approaching end, as-sa'a, and the consequences, either heaven or hell. This is a very apocalyptic beginning to the Quranic message. And then I did a comparison to the subject of the afterlife. Compare how many times there's verses warning of punishment, describing hell, versus how many verses encouraging the believers or describing heaven to them. And it's quite strong, the relationship. It seems the balance is definitely tilted to the left. You have 42 verses warning the unbelievers in Mecca, compared to only 7 verses in these first 10 surahs that are assuring and encouraging the believers that they will be rewarded. You have 22 verses here describing hell, versus only 5 ayat describing heaven. And likewise, similarly, in the next 11 surahs by mean verse length order, the majority, 29 verses, warning the unbelievers that they must change or they're going to face the consequences, to only 10 encouraging, providing relief to the believers. And again, a higher number, 25 verses describing the fire, describing hellfire, to 20 describing the gardens. And if you subtract some of these verses here, where verses of encouragement are directed specifically to the Prophet himself, not to the other believers. If you subtract those 3 verses in the first 10 and 4 in the last, you only have 10 verses that are addressed to the believers in Mecca, that they are going to be rewarded in the very earliest surahs of the Quran. And that, so right here, this number would be 10 compared to 71 verses that are filled with stern warnings to the unbelievers. And the overall comparison over the first 21 surahs by the mean verse length measure shows a large majority of warnings and descriptions of hell versus a smaller number of encouraging verses and descriptions of heaven. It's even more pronounced in the first 10 surahs, 64-9, a ratio of over 7-1 versus warning. So it's a very strong, exceedingly strong initial message. There's one good example of this, many examples, but one in Mudaththir. I'll just read some of the verses. In this particular surah, the 4th in the number as far as its shortest verse lengths, so likely a very early revelation. There are some 34 verses that are addressed to the Meccan unbelievers, and only 2 verses that are describing the blessed. Here, for example, سأصليه سقر وما أدراك ما سقر لا تبقي ولا تذر لواحة للبشر عليه 19. What Brother Shabir mentioned, talked about, 19. Then later on in the surah, كل نفس بما كسبت رهينة إلا أصحاب اليمين في جنات يتساءلون عن المجرمين. And they're asking about the guilty. And these verses describe very vividly what they're going to be, they're experiencing. They're asking, مَا سَلَكَهُمْ فِي سَقَرٍ. And here the damned are replying from hell. قَالُوا لَمْ نَكُ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ وَلَمْ نَكُ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ وَكُنَّا نَخُوضُ مَعَ الْخَائِضِينَ وَكُنَّا نُكَذِّبُ بِيَوْمِ الدِّينِ حَتَّى أَتَانَا الْيَقِينَ فَمَا تَنْفَعُهُمْ الشَّفَاعَةُ الشَّافِعِينَ. Looking at the translation of these frightening verses, I will surely roast the unbeliever, the one who's denying the Quran, denying this message, roast him in saqar. And what will teach you what is saqar? It spares not, neither leaves alone, scorching the flesh. Over it are 19, probably 19 angels guarding hell. They can't escape the damned. Every soul shall be pledged for what it has earned, save the companions of the right, except them. In gardens they will question. And these are the only 2 verses in Al-Mudaththir that are talking about the blessed. And even in these 2 verses, it's not about all what they are enjoying in heaven. They're described as asking about what's happened to the people in hell. So it puts the emphasis right back on those in hell. In gardens they will question concerning the sinners, what thrusted you into Saqr? And here the damned reply, they shall say, we were not of those who prayed, and we fed not the needy, and we plunged into vain discourse along with the plungers, and we cried lies to the day of doom, till the certain came to us. Then the intercession of the intercessors shall not profit them. In conclusion, relating this early Quranic message to its context, it seems to make perfect sense. If we recall in Mecca, initially when the revelations initially was descending on the prophet, he was addressing pagans. And later, as more people gathered around him, believers started gathering around him, and this number of believers grew, then you have more verses describing the afterlife, describing heaven, and encouraging these new believers. Bart Ehrman in North Carolina has noticed a similar trend in the Christian tradition. He wrote a book, Journeys to Heaven and Hell, Tours of the Afterlife in the Early Christian Tradition. In the Apocalypse of Peter, which was composed in the early 2nd century, this is when the Roman Empire, before this city was made the capital of the new Christian empire, at that point in the early 2nd century, most of the Roman Empire were pagans. And here we find 10 chapters describing the wicked being punished, and only one chapter, on the contrary, describing the blessings of those Christians, the righteous. But later, about 200 years later, when Christians became the majority in the empire, you find a much more balanced portrayal. Yes, of course, there's still lots of numerous chapters describing hell and all the suffering that the sinners will undergo, but you also have numerous chapters describing heaven and all the wonderful things the believers, the Christians, will enjoy. So I'd like to close with a quote from St. Augustine, who says, "There's no conversion without fear." Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Thank you very much, Professor Farrin, for the very informative. In parallel to the study of oral transmission, I think it might be relevant to integrate the study of the written transmission to, especially relating to the first century manuscripts, the Hijazi manuscripts, and because there's also a problem to be solved there in relation to the orthographic variations, the variant spelling of words, especially related to medial long vowel elifs. Majority of the orthographic variations are related to medial elifs. And what value do you think there is in enhancing this study with an integrated approach, incorporating both the oral transmission and the written transmission, and leveraging those first century manuscripts? And would that add more clarity as far as the counting system is concerned? And do you think the counting system would add more clarity on the written transmission side to the orthographic variation problem?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. This is a very hotly debated field right now among academics studying the Quran. Of course, the hadith, the written tradition, says that the Quran was memorized and then preserved on just fragments on camel bones and so forth until the Uthmanic period, when a committee was formed to write it down. And the thing is, some of the earliest manuscripts, they were being tested by radiocarbon dating, and they seem to precede the time of Uthman. And there are now about 4 or 5 or 6 manuscripts that have earlier dating. So it is puzzling. I argue, especially in relation to, there's a Dutch scholar, his last name is Van Putten, who's compared 16 Uthmanic manuscripts. And they have slight variations in their orthography, but I think they all write the ta marbuta in a certain way. It's not a way you'd hear pronounced, but it's a visual way that's identical. And he concludes that these are all, of course, they're all going back to the Uthmanic type. Standard Quran is the archetype. But he concludes these were all visually copied because they're all writing the same letter in the same way. They're not hearing it and putting a ta marbuta. I'm just starting to look at this, but it seems to be, I mean, that's some very interesting finding, but I think these systems are a product of dictational copying, because some of the the differences are widely separated. So you couldn't have someone looking at an example Quran and then putting the divider like a line or two down on the text. It seems like they're hearing a rhyme in this particular position that is similar to an end rhyme. In fact, these are mostly what the differences are about. Alif, Lam, Mim, in the beginning of Al-Baqarah. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِي هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. So you have a similarity in rhyme, and it seems like by dictation, one scribe is maybe hearing this rhyme and considering it here in this place an end rhyme where it's just an internal rhyme. I hope to do more work on this and try to show it, but I think these are examples of dictational copying that might have spread to Damascus and Basra and Kufa before the Uthmanic time, that maybe even there was an original written mushaf in Medina that was used for dictational copying as the Islamic Ummah spread very quickly. And then later there was a process that Uthman, no, we need to have the one Uthmanic mushaf and every text needs to be corrected to that. But maybe these copying systems predate that by 10 years or something like that. I think there's signs of a very early primitive copying stage by a matter of listening. One scribe looking at the mushaf and reading the verses, and then someone else copying them. But this is it's actively being discussed, and hopefully more discoveries will clarify this. Thank you.